January 23, 1963, Beirut, Lebanon. At 10:31 a.m., a secure teletype at Admiralty House in London printed a short cable from the British Embassy in Beirut. Philby missing since last night. Residence vacated. Simultaneously, GCHQ intercept stations logged a Soviet merchant freighter, Dolmatova, leaving Beirut harbor at 12 knots. Traffic analysis confirmed the vessel's radio silence, a procedural indicator used during exfiltration operations. Harold Kim Philby was not merely a former MI6 officer. He had supervised Section V, the British service responsible for anti-Soviet counterintelligence. He had served as MI6 liaison to CIA and FBI, receiving privileged access to US, UK joint operations, NATO assessments, and early Cold War covert action planning. Between 1944 and 1951, dozens of CIA and MI6 missions into Albania, Ukraine, and the Baltic States collapsed with near-total loss rates. In 1963, analysts in London and Washington faced a documented question recorded in a declassified MI5 memorandum. How long had Philby been working for the Soviet Union, and how much had he already compromised? Summer 1940, Street Albans, England. The British Secret Intelligence Service was expanding rapidly. Personnel records showed that Harold Adrian Russell Philby, known as Kim, entered SIS Section 5 during the wartime expansion triggered by the Battle of Britain. Section V held responsibility for counterintelligence operations against German and Soviet intelligence services. Under Chief of SIS Stuart Menzies and Section V head Valentine Vivian, young officers with university credentials and strong anti-communist backgrounds were recruited to analyze intercepts from German Abwehr networks and build early wartime censorship units. Philby's entry appeared routine. MI6 Personnel File PF, Box 151, declassified in 2006, confirms his rapid promotion through the service's wartime file systems and signals analysis desks. His background seemed impeccable: Cambridge-educated, foreign correspondent experience, family connections to British colonial administration in India. Soviet archives released in the 1990s revealed a different timeline. According to KGB First Chief Directorate files, Philby had been recruited in 1934 while still at Cambridge University, operating under the codename Sonny. This meant that from day one of his MI6 employment, he was supplying Moscow with classified assessments on German intelligence structures, Allied deception operations, and post-war occupation planning. Soviet files documented regular courier transfers to Moscow during this period. For 6 years, Philby's dual role remained undetected. The man recruited to defend Britain against Soviet penetration was already Moscow's asset inside the heart of British intelligence. By 1944, Philby had become head of Section 9, the SIS anti-communist desk supervising all operations across Europe. CIS Section V briefing logs show Philby reviewing every major anti-Soviet operation planned by British intelligence. British planners at the time believed Soviet intelligence penetration of Western services was limited and manageable. The strategic assumption was clear: wartime cooperation with Moscow would transition into competitive but controllable post-war intelligence rivalry. KGB archives opened in the 1990s confirmed that Philby relayed nearly every major assessment back to Moscow Center. KGB First Chief Directorate files list him under the code name Stanley, providing detailed intelligence on Allied deception plans, including portions of the post-war occupation strategy for Germany and Eastern Europe. Philby operated within MI6's London Signals Room, handling wartime cipher pads and accessing the service's central registry systems. His colleagues included Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, both already recruited members of the Cambridge spy ring, though their collaboration remained concealed within the bureaucratic structure of British intelligence. The contradiction was absolute. The man tasked with combating Soviet espionage across Europe was Moscow's deepest asset inside the Western intelligence apparatus. 1946. Washington, D.C. The post-war intelligence partnership between Britain and America was consolidating. Philby was appointed MI6 liaison to the United States, stationed in Washington with direct access to the CIA's Office of Special Operations and FBI counterintelligence divisions. CIA, OSO, and FBI counterintelligence logs confirmed that Philby received daily briefings on joint Anglo-American covert action planning across Eastern Europe. The strategic expectation in Washington was straightforward. US-UK intelligence integration would improve operational success rates in contested areas behind the Iron Curtain. British experience in clandestine operations, combined with American resources and growing technical capabilities, was projected to produce significant results against Soviet intelligence networks. Philby's role granted him access to early CIA crypto systems, FBI internal security memoranda, and SIS cable traffic flowing between London and Washington. He attended planning sessions with Alan Dulles, maintained operational contact with James Angleton of CIA counterintelligence, and participated in coordination meetings involving J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. Declassified CIA reports reviewed decades later show failure rates of 80 to 100% for joint US-UK operations between 1947 and 1951. CIA analysts later wrote that the failure pattern matched precise leak timings available only to a senior liaison officer with advanced access to operational planning. The documented outcome was systemic operational failure across multiple CIA theaters, losses later attributed directly to Soviet penetration at the senior liaison level. 1949, Malta, Cyprus, and Italy served as launch points for CIA operations into Albania. Operation Valuable represented the agency's first major attempt to support anti-communist resistance movements behind the Iron Curtain. Under CIA officer Frank Wisner and MI6's Neil Billy McLean, small teams of Albanian emigres were trained, equipped, and deployed via C-47 transport aircraft and covert naval routes into the mountainous interior of Albania. The objective was to establish contact with anti-communist guerrilla groups, provide them with weapons and communications equipment, and build intelligence networks that could report on Soviet military activities in the Balkans. Each mission followed detailed operational planning, infiltration routes, drop zones, safe houses, and courier schedules were mapped and approved through joint CIA/MI6 coordination. All 9 infiltration missions failed. CIA declassification documents released in 2005 confirm 100% casualty or capture rates. Teams were intercepted within hours or days of insertion. Equipment caches were pre-positioned by Albanian security forces. Resistance contacts were already under surveillance or had been arrested before the teams arrived. A 1954 CIA internal review noted, "The probability of coincidence is statistically negligible." Philby had attended the planning meetings for these operations in Washington. KGB archives confirmed decades later that he relayed infiltration routes, exact landing points, and personnel identities directly to Moscow Center, which forwarded the intelligence to Albanian state security weeks before each mission launched. By 1951, Operation Valuable had been abandoned. The human cost was total. Simultaneously, MI6 stay-behind networks across the Baltic States were collapsing at unprecedented rates. MI6 had established covert resistance networks in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Ukraine during the final years of World War II and the immediate post-war period. These networks supplied with encrypted radio sets, SOE-style drop containers, and early CIA cipher pads were designed to provide intelligence on Soviet military deployments and maintain contact with anti-Soviet partisan groups operating in the forests of Eastern Europe. Between 1949 and 1952, these networks reported abrupt and systematic roll-ups. Agents were arrested. Safe houses were raided. Radio operators disappeared. Couriers were intercepted. KGB files released after the Cold War confirmed Soviet intelligence possessed precise knowledge of drop points, courier schedules, and codebook systems. By 1952, Baltic networks had collapsed at 5 times the rate expected in standard hostile counterintelligence environments, a statistical anomaly that pointed directly toward a penetration at the source level. A classified CIA assessment from this period concluded, pattern suggests a single source at a senior level with access to joint planning. MI6's own internal review noted a collapse of entire networks inconsistent with typical counterintelligence attrition. The losses were not random, they were systematic, comprehensive, and precisely timed. Philby's position also allowed him to compromise one of the West's most sensitive signals intelligence programs, Venona. The Venona project was a joint US-UK effort to decrypt Soviet diplomatic and intelligence communications intercepted during and after World War II, operated by the U.S. Army Signal Security Agency using classified bigot decrypt terminals. Venona represented the West's most significant breakthrough in understanding Soviet espionage networks operating in America and Britain. NSA Venona decrypt logbooks, declassified decades later, show inconsistent patterns in Soviet cipher adjustments during the late 1940s. Soviet 5-digit telegraph codes, previously vulnerable to Western cryptanalysis, were suddenly modified in ways that suggested Moscow had been briefed on decryption progress. KGB archives confirm that Philby provided detailed intelligence to Moscow about Western code-breaking attempts against Soviet communications. A declassified NSA note from the Venona Review states, "Cipher changes occurred within days of internal briefings Philby attended." The compromise was strategic. Moscow adjusted its communication security protocols in direct response to intelligence. Philby supplied about Western decrypt capabilities, significantly reducing the volume of Soviet traffic that could be successfully decrypted through the remainder of the 1950s. The Venona penetration represented not just operational betrayal, it was the compromise of the West's ability to monitor Soviet intelligence activity in real time. May 1951, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean vanished from Britain. MI5 surveillance logs indicate the two diplomats were last seen boarding a ferry to France. Both men, senior Foreign Office officials with access to classified Anglo-American communications, had been under suspicion following breakthroughs in Venona decrypts that pointed towards Soviet penetration of the British government. Their sudden defection to Moscow triggered an immediate classified review inside MI5. The 1952 MI5 report marked restricted identified Philby as the probable third man, who had warned Burgess and McLean that British counterintelligence was closing in. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Philby had been in contact with both men. He had access to information about the MI5 investigation. The timing of the warning and the defection matched patterns consistent with insider knowledge. MI6 insisted the evidence was insufficient for prosecution. Political leadership resisted action to avoid public scandal. The exposure of a spy ring inside the Foreign Office and intelligence services would damage Britain's relationship with the United States and undermine confidence in the security of NATO intelligence sharing. The absence of prosecution allowed Philby to continue operations for another decade. He was recalled from Washington, subjected to internal questioning, and eventually cleared by a parliamentary statement in 1955 that declared there was no evidence he had betrayed his country. The decision proved catastrophic. 1956. Philby was posted to Beirut as a correspondent for The Economist and The Observer, operating under MI6 cover. Beirut in the 1950s served as a critical intelligence hub in the Middle East. Western agencies maintained networks across the region, monitoring Soviet activities, tracking arms flows, and cultivating assets within Arab governments and militaries. Philby's posting provided him access to Beirut cable station intercept logs and regional intelligence coordination. He maintained his cover as a journalist while continuing clandestine contact with Soviet handlers. KGB memos indicate continued intelligence transfers throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. Cipher pads were stored inside household items. Dead drops were arranged in locations across Beirut. By 1962, however, new evidence had emerged. Soviet defector Anatoly Golitsyn provided information to Western intelligence that pointed directly toward a high-level penetration inside British intelligence. Someone who had served in Washington, had access to joint operations, and remained active. MI6 officer Nicholas Elliott, Philby's longtime colleague and friend, was dispatched to Beirut to conduct a final interview. The interrogation took place in December 1962 inside an SIS safe house. MI6 interview records summarize the session. Philby admitted to certain unauthorized contacts with Soviet officials, but denied being a Soviet agent. He acknowledged errors in judgment but maintained he had never betrayed classified information that harmed British interests. Elliot wrote privately after the session. He spoke as a man expecting rescue. MI6 expected closure. KGB archival documents show Moscow Center had already prepared extraction plans. January 23, 1963, Beirut Harbor. GCHQ intercept log event 63-011 recorded the departure of the Soviet merchant freighter Dolmatova at 12 knots, heading east toward Soviet waters. The vessel maintained strict radio silence, a protocol associated with Soviet merchant fleet extraction procedures for intelligence operatives. Philby had boarded the freighter the previous night. His residence in Beirut was found vacated. Personal items were left behind. No official departure was recorded with Lebanese authorities. The exfiltration had been executed during what a CIA post-operation review later described as the window of least surveillance coverage, a brief period when Western monitoring of Soviet vessels in Beirut was reduced due to operational shifts and personnel changes. The escape was complete. Philby had vanished into Soviet protection, beyond the reach of British or American prosecution. Between 1963 and 1965, the CIA and MI5 conducted a joint damage assessment of Philby's 30-year penetration of Western intelligence. The statistical findings were catastrophic. Dozens of Western agents had been compromised. Multiple failed multi-year operations, including the entirety of Operation Valuable and the Baltic resistance networks, were directly attributable to intelligence Philby supplied to Moscow. CIA paramilitary expenditures in failed resistance operations had exceeded $4.5 million by 1952, equivalent to approximately $50 million in current value. SIS personnel losses in Eastern Europe had risen sharply during Philby's tenure, with entire networks collapsing in patterns inconsistent with normal counterintelligence attrition. Early NATO planning documents, joint US-UK covert action strategies, and Venona decrypt progress had all been exposed to Soviet intelligence. The National Security Archive in Washington assessed Philby as the most damaging mole in the history of Western intelligence. A CIA summary from the damage assessment concluded, impact immeasurable but undeniably strategic. The compromise extended beyond individual operations. It had shaped Soviet understanding of Western intelligence capabilities, strategic thinking, and operational planning throughout the early Cold War. The betrayal was institutional, comprehensive, and multi-generational in its consequences. If you value fact-based Cold War history, consider supporting Cold War files. Philby arrived in Moscow in early 1963 and was received as a hero of the Soviet Union. Soviet Press Bureau records confirm he was awarded the Order of Lenin, the highest civilian decoration in the USSR. He later received the Red Banner for his service to Soviet intelligence. He was given an apartment, a pension, and a position lecturing at KGB training facilities. KGB training syllabuses from the 1960s and 70s reference Philby's lectures on Western intelligence structures, operational security, and the psychology of long-term penetration operations. He provided instruction to Soviet intelligence officers on how to assess targets, maintain cover, and exploit institutional weaknesses inside Western agencies. An MI5 report from the 1980s noted, Philby's skills and experience informed a generation of Soviet intelligence officers. His influence extended beyond his own operational career. He became a model for Soviet intelligence doctrine on deep cover, penetration of hostile services. Philby lived in Moscow until his death in 1988. He gave occasional interviews to Western journalists, maintained correspondence with former colleagues, and never expressed regret for his actions. He described himself as a committed communist who had served the cause he believed in. The long-term consequences of the Philby case reshaped Western intelligence practice. In 1964, Britain passed internal intelligence restructuring reforms that fundamentally changed MI5, MI6 cooperation protocols. Formal vetting programs were established to assess ideological background, personal associations, and foreign contacts of intelligence personnel. Security clearance procedures were tightened across NATO intelligence structures. Intelligence compartmentation restricting access to classified information on a strict need-to-know basis became standard practice across Western agencies. The assumption that senior officers could be trusted with broad access to operational planning, was replaced by systematic controls and oversight mechanisms. The CIA shifted strategic emphasis away from large-scale infiltration operations and resistance support networks toward technical intelligence collection, signals intelligence, satellite reconnaissance, and imagery analysis. The failures in Albania and the Baltic States demonstrated the vulnerability of human intelligence networks to penetration. Technical collection offered greater security and reduced dependence on vulnerable agents. In a 1981 interview, CIA Director William Casey summarized the lesson that had been learned at extraordinary cost. One well-placed mole can defeat an army of case officers. Philby's case remains a central study in Western counterintelligence doctrine taught at intelligence training facilities, analyzed in classified reviews, and cited as the definitive example of institutional penetration. The damage he inflicted shaped not just operations, but the fundamental structure of how Western democracies conduct intelligence work in an era of ideological conflict. The betrayal was personal, operational, and strategic. But the legacy was institutional, a permanent transformation in how intelligence services protect themselves against the threat from within. Subscribe and like. And if you have anything on your mind, write a comment under the video on Cold War Files.